5 of Mastering Your Fertility podcast. The show is all about reclaiming health, enhancing fertility, and preparing you for pregnancy. I'm Dr. Haley Nye, a licensed naturopathic physician and nutritionist.
And I'm Kristen Cornett, a certified nutritional therapy practitioner.
And we are the creators of the online fertility platform, Tiny Feet. As always, thank you so much for listening, and we appreciate you being here, and we hope that you learn something new that will help you on your fertility journey. In today's episode, we're going to be sharing one of the most important changes that you can make to support your fertility and have a healthy pregnancy, and that's giving up sugar and refined foods.
Oh, man.
I know. We know that this might be challenging for some of you, probably most of us, right? But stick with us here. We'll help you understand the science behind how sugar behaves in your body, why this is harmful to your health, your fertility, and your future baby, which foods to eliminate, and which foods to add to make sure that your baby gets the best nutrition possible. Since this episode is all about sugar and refined foods, we should probably start off by talking about what these things are. So Kristen's going to start us off.
All right. So when we talk about sugar, I think everybody understands what actual sugar is, but it's a little bit more complex than that. So there are a ton of different sources of both natural and refined sugars. And there are also two categories of carbohydrate that also convert to sugar in your body. So the two primary categories of carbohydrate are simple carbs and complex carbs. And you may have heard of these before. You know, the complex carbs are the good ones. The reason that we say that is that simple carbs have larger amounts of sugar molecules, and they're arranged in really simple structures, which means that they break down really easily in our digestive tract to sugar that absorbs directly into our bloodstream and affects our blood sugar. So complex carbohydrates have fewer glucose molecules, and they're arranged in more complex structures. And those foods also have fiber in them, which slows the breakdown of those foods and helps them absorb slower into the bloodstream, and they have less of an effect on blood sugar. So refined foods are like, if you're talking about like white flour, for instance. So white flour, you take a grain that has all these living parts of the plant, the bran and the germ, and that's what makes that grain perishable. So if you want to make it into a non-perishable food product, you have to strip out all of those living parts of it and basically just grind the remaining starch into flour. And so these starchy flours they're very refined. They're highly simple carbohydrates. They absorb very quickly into our bloodstream, and they affect our blood sugar significantly. So the whole point of all of this is that carbohydrate foods affect blood sugar, and the types of carbohydrates that we eat affects how much our blood sugar increases. And obviously, we're going to spend some time talking about why blood sugar is so important. The other reason that these foods are problematic is that when you take out all those living parts of a plant and refine it, you strip out all the nutrients. So the bran of a grain is where all the fiber is. So you take that out. And then you take out the germ, where there's all these like wonderful nutrients that help a plant grow and germinate into a new plant. You strip those out too, and all you're really left with is these sort of like empty calories and sugars.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, I don't think most people know how flour is made. They think you just like take a whole grain and you grind it into something, and that's not quite how it works.
Right, exactly. Yeah, they have to strip it down first. So, and did you tell us about what kind of things happen in our body when we do eat these refined carbs?
Yeah, so excessive intake of refined carbohydrates, which I think excessive, we'll talk about what excessive means. I think it's a little bit less than what people may think it is. I mean, basically just eating these for every meal, like eating a bagel in the morning and a sandwich for lunch and pasta for dinner might seem pretty moderate to some people, but that's actually pretty excessive in terms of refined carbohydrates. So when we eat this way on a regular basis, our bodies respond with some pretty serious metabolic issues like obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and a whole host of other chronic illnesses that science has linked with excessive simple carbohydrate consumption.
Okay. So the major reason why these foods are problematic is because they're messing with the blood sugar regulation in our body.
Yes.
Correct? And so how does blood sugar actually work in the body?
Yeah, so we talked about simple and complex carbs and how those affect blood sugar, how simple carbs jack up the blood sugar much more quickly than complex carbohydrates. So basically, whenever we eat a food that contains carbohydrate, our blood sugar increases, and it increases more when we eat simple carbs. But elevated blood sugar is really harmful to the body. It's super damaging to our organs, our tissues, our blood vessels. So the body has to have a mechanism to bring blood sugar back down when it gets elevated. And it does this through a hormone called insulin. And insulin is produced in our pancreas and released whenever the body senses that need to lower blood sugar. So how much insulin we need is dependent on how much sugar we eat. So obviously, the more sugar we eat, the more insulin we need. And many people actually have an exaggerated insulin response. So we eat simple carbohydrates and our blood sugar spikes and the body kind of panics a little bit and it shoots out like maybe too much insulin. And then we can end up with something called hypoglycemia, which is low blood sugar. We get too much insulin. The insulin moves too much blood sugar into our cells out of our bloodstream. And then we get these symptoms of like being tired or super hungry, or maybe even a little bit irritable in between meals. And we start to crave those simple carbohydrates to bring our blood sugar back up.
Got it. So you're saying that when we eat a simple carb, such as pasta, it can be absorbed quite quickly into our bloodstream and it spikes the blood sugar up. And then immediately our pancreas is secreting a large amount of insulin to be able to get that blood sugar back down, but it can overshoot. So then it just drops the blood sugar too low. And then you experience this reactive glycemia. And that is, I've definitely experienced that myself, where you feel shaky and all you can think about is like getting that quick sugar again to get your blood sugar back up. So it seems like a vicious cycle.
It definitely is a vicious cycle. Like I mentioned, you know, if we're eating a bagel for breakfast and a sandwich for lunch and pasta for dinner, we're doing this multiple times a day. And that doesn't even count like snacks in between, because most people, if they're eating that way, aren't making it to the next meal before they're feeling ravenously hungry. You know, you eat a big bowl of sugary cereal for breakfast and you're starving by 10 a.m., right? Like you're headed to the break room for coffee and a candy bar. So we're doing this, you know, at least 3 times a day for most people, sometimes 4, 5, 6 times a day, we're having this reactive hypoglycemia reaction. So, I mean, obviously our cells need sugar for energy. Then again, they can also use fat for energy, but that's kind of a separate thing. We'll talk about that later.
The brain needs sugar.
Yeah, the brain does run on glucose. The brain can also run on ketones, which are, you know, a byproduct of fatty acid metabolism. Once again, separate issue. But, you know, we do use sugar in our cells for energy, but we don't have like an unlimited storage capacity for energy. And we'll talk about kind of what happens in a second.
Okay. So it sounds like there's a lot of unpleasant symptoms throughout the day that we're experiencing. Some people might recognize that this is a sugar crash, and others might just think that they're not feeling well and they don't understand why.
They're just tired and they need coffee at 2 or 3 p.m. every single day to get through the rest of the day. So,
So tell us about what symptoms people might be experiencing.
So we kind of already talked about like the tired, hungry, craving, simple carbohydrate issues, but there are some other ones like you can start to get headaches or be super irritable, maybe even a little bit dizzy in between meals, like your blood sugar drops low enough and you will be dizzy and not feel very well. Also things like poor sleep. If you're waking up a couple of hours after going to sleep at night, that's most likely a low blood sugar crash, and your body is actually spiking a stress hormone to like bring your blood sugar back up and to try to keep you going. So if you're awakening a few hours after you go to sleep and you're having a hard time getting back to sleep, that's a sign of poor blood sugar regulation. We talked about coffee a little bit. Those stimulants, those help increase your blood sugar and give you a little boost of energy to get through the rest of the day. So if you're feeling like you need coffee and a candy bar at 2 or 3 p.m., you're probably not doing so well in the blood sugar department. Also, if you have an excessive appetite, if you're binge eating at any point throughout the day, feeling really sleepy in the afternoon, if you feel tired and your fatigue is relieved by eating, that's another sign that your blood sugar might be, I mean, that's obviously you're putting food in your body, you're increasing your blood sugar and you feel better. That's a sign that you were probably dealing with some low blood sugar before that.
Or even the opposite of that is after a meal, you feel excessively tired.
Yes.
Because really high blood sugar in your bloodstream can make you feel lethargic.
Yeah. And so that's kind of when you start to cross that line, you're no longer hypoglycemic, you're starting to cross into being hyperglycemic. So I think that's the next thing that we're going to talk about is what happens after that reactive hypoglycemia over time.
Yeah, go for it.
So when we're constantly putting sugar into our bodies and we're constantly pumping out insulin to manage this influx of blood sugar, our cells are being constantly bombarded with insulin's message. So we have these little receptors on our cells for insulin. And when insulin binds to those receptors, it basically opens the floodgate so that sugar can get into the cell and out of the bloodstream. So that's the primary mechanism by which insulin works. And when we're constantly exposed to insulin's message, our cells will actually start to decrease the number of receptors on their surface so that our cells are less responsive to insulin's message. And this is called insulin resistance. So when we're insulin resistant, we don't have as many receptors on our cells. So we need more insulin to try to stuff more sugar into the cells. And the cells are already trying to tell us that they're full. They don't have any more storage capacity for glucose. But in order to regulate our blood sugar, we just have to keep pumping out insulin, right? So eventually the pancreas starts to wear out a little bit. We keep pumping out insulin. The pancreas is like, no, I'm tired.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when we start to, in addition to being insulin resistant, we start to kind of climb that blood sugar ladder. And that's when we get like pre-diabetes and then eventually diabetes when our blood sugar starts to rise. We can't control it any longer.
Yeah. That sounds really interesting and happening all over the United States, at least, right?
Yeah, there was a study in 2015 that estimated that 52% of the US population was either pre-diabetic or diabetic.
52%.
52%. That's more than half of the US adult population is experiencing elevated blood sugar in some form, either pre-diabetic or diabetic. And that is crazy insane. I mean, we already talked about how elevated blood sugar can cause all these problems for us, like all these metabolic issues and chronic disease, like cardiovascular disease. And then we wonder why we have this epidemic of these diseases, right? So,
right, exactly. So they probably are walking around with a lot of those symptoms as well.
And they may be. And the thing is that, you can be insulin resistant before you ever get an elevated blood sugar reading at the doctor's office. So, and then many people aren't going to the doctor for their yearly checkups anyway. So they're either not getting their blood sugar checked on a regular basis. The study also mentioned that in addition to all these people being pre-diabetic and diabetic, that most of these people are walking around undiagnosed.
Right.
They don't actually know that they're having these issues. So I think it's important to shed some light on these symptoms so that people understand that if you're experiencing these things, you're either already on that, blood sugar roller coaster, or you're heading up the ladder toward diabetes.
Yeah, exactly. So what does this have to do with fertility, right? So we're going to talk about how this affects your fertility in both partners, and why it's important to be able to regulate your blood sugar to be able to improve your overall fertility and the health of your future baby.
Yeah, take it away.
All right. So elevated insulin disrupts your hormone balance in the ovaries. So ovaries are overly sensitive to insulin, and they have an abundance of receptors on the surface of their cells. And when you're becoming insulin resistant, the fat muscles or the fat cells and the muscle cells are going to be the ones that downregulate those receptors, but the ovaries actually don't downregulate those receptors. So when your pancreas is spitting out a bunch of insulin, the ovaries are getting overstimulated.
Right.
And when they're getting overstimulated by insulin, so one job of insulin is actually to build up things. And so it's a signal to the body that says, hey, we have sugar available. Let's start building things. It's like you're ready to press go on building a house or something, right? Mm-hmm. Instead of stopping because you don't have any building materials. And so what the ovaries do is they start creating more androgen type of hormones, which is like testosterone.
So male hormones.
Male hormones, exactly. And testosterone is a building up hormone, mm-hmm. right? And so that's why men has a lot more testosterone than women do, and they build more muscle. And so that's how it becomes disruptive to your hormone balance, is it leans more on the side of androgen or male type of hormones. And then what happens is it can actually lead to a lack of ovulation and classic signs of PCOS, which is the polycystic ovarian syndrome. And that's a common cause of infertility
Right.
if you're not ovulating. So there was a study that showed that women who consume simple carbs are 73% more likely to experience ovulatory infertility, meaning you are ovulating, but for some reason you're actually not being able to become pregnant. So this could be partially due to poor egg and follicle development, implantation failure, and then also poor embryo development, meaning that you actually did conceive, but the embryo is unable to develop accurately. And then imbalanced blood sugar is really stressful on the body, so it's going to pump out more cortisol levels, and it will contribute to adrenal dysfunction and also deplete your sex hormones. So instead of even, it might cause hormonal imbalance, but it can also lead to depletion and hormone production, possibly due because you're also pumping out too much cortisol.
Okay, so cortisol is a stress hormone,
Mm-hmm.
and it's one of the main hormones produced by the adrenal glands.
Yes.
And your adrenals kind of interact like with the rest of your endocrine system and your ovaries to manage your sex hormone production.
Yes.
Okay, so the big deal with cortisol is two things, right? So one is that it's made from the same precursor molecule that our sex hormones are made from, which is called pregnenolone.
Exactly.
So when we're making too much cortisol, we don't have enough pregnenolone left over to basically produce the sex hormones that we need to have a balanced cycle.
Right. Especially if you're not eating enough healthy fats to balance out the excess of carbohydrates that you might be eating in your diet as well. That can happen pretty quickly. And it can also lead to thyroid issues.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Another part of the endocrine system.
Mm-hmm.
So
the thyroid, adrenals, and then, your ovaries.
I mean, so the other thing about cortisol is that when we have elevated cortisol, your body is sensing it's a stress response.
Right.
So you're kind of placing your body into this fight or flight mode. And when we're doing that, we're prioritizing basically survival functions, and we're putting these other functions like reproduction kind of on the back burner.
Exactly.
And it does that like to our immune systems too. So, if you're in a more primitive time, your body is responding like you're running away from like a bear or a tiger, or you're being attacked by a neighboring tribe. Like your body knows that this isn't a good time to become pregnant. This isn't a good time to be reproducing. So our bodies are so smart.
Yeah, they really are.
The innate intelligence is just fascinating to me. I mean, the more we learn.
Whoever knew that, eating simple carbohydrates throughout the day and kind of thriving on those as your diet is actually producing this stress hormone cortisol and then suppressing your ability to conceive.
I mean, it's crazy that our bodies do that, but I think one of the main points, which we're going to cover later when we talk about diet and the dietary sources of some of these things, is that we didn't have access to these kinds of foods all year round in massive quantities. I mean, you might have found some wild fruit, some berries, like maybe an apple tree. What I've heard is that wild apples are not sweet like the cultivated varieties that we have in grocery stores today. So, I mean, the amount of sugar that we're able to get, not only from having fruit all year round because we transport food all over the globe, but, also just these refined sugars, these highly processed things, like we wouldn't have had the ability to produce high fructose corn syrup from a corn plant. Like, it's just, I don't know. It's crazy to me what we've done to food and how we just sort of expect our bodies to be able to adapt and handle that.
Well,
and they can't.
Case in point, they can't, because half of the U.S. population is now pre-diabetic or diabetic.
Yep.
So, case in point.
Yeah.
So research has shown that insulin resistance in women is also associated with, again, I think we talked about the poor egg and follicular development, implantation failure. And so in men, though, particularly, insulin resistance and increased intake of simple carbohydrates correlate with lower testosterone levels.
Oh, well, that's not good. So we have women consuming carbs and they're getting too much testosterone and disrupting their ovulation, and men are having lower testosterone.
Yeah. And oftentimes when you have too high of a simple carbohydrate diet, you develop adiposity, which is fat development in the middle of your abdomen. And then that fat development actually will turn testosterone into estrogen.
Yeah.
And so it's aromatizing is what they call it, the enzyme of the testosterone into estrogen. And thus men are being more estrogenic and lower testosterone.
So I think that's a really important point to cover, just in case everybody didn't catch that. So when you have more fat around your abdomen, that fat is hormone tissue. It's hormone producing, and it can either directly produce estrogen or cause testosterone to be converted into estrogen in men. So this is kind of an interesting point. So when you see men with breast tissue, that's not just like fat that's just hanging out there. That's actual breast tissue. They're actually growing boobs from that estrogen conversion.
Right. Yeah. And that would be an extreme case. However, estrogen does lend to even more fat development around the hips of a man. And so the more that they eat this type of diet, the harder it is to get back to the type of like shape of what, a man should be shaped like, because they're producing this estrogen. So yeah, that's really interesting. And then of course, due to the low testosterone, it's going to also reduce semen quality.
And that testosterone affects like pretty much every
aspect of semen quality.
Yeah. Count, motility, morphology, all of that.
Exactly. And then also it's going to lead to, so the elevated blood sugars we talked about in the very beginning, when it's in your bloodstream, causes inflammatory type of damage, oxidative stress. And then of course the egg and sperm cells are going to be part of that damage. So also we noticed that there's specific research that is showing that excess carbohydrate intake during pregnancy leads to preeclampsia.
Oh,
so
elevated blood pressure and inflammation and
so we don't think it's the thing that's causing preeclampsia, but it's certainly contributing to that. It leads to gallbladder issues. A lot of pregnant women have issues with gallbladder, and it's the number one surgery that they go through during pregnancy.
Yeah, we talked about that. Talked about that last episode when we talked about choline.
Yep. And so when you have an imbalance of healthy fats and excess carbohydrates, that can contribute to poor gallbladder function. Excessive weight gain during pregnancy can be very problematic to your baby, and then your baby can be overly large. And so in utero, it could just continue to grow above 9 pounds, which is considered large for gestational age.
So that can cause birth complications.
Yes.
Can make it more difficult.
Increase chance for C-section.
Or injury to your baby during natural birth.
Exactly.
It's kind of scary.
Insulin resistance will also increase your risk for miscarriage and gestational diabetes.
Well, the miscarriage, I mean, that's a really big deal. Anything that we find that may increase the risk of miscarriage is worth noting, because, I mean, in this country, we're experiencing 25% of known pregnancies are ending in loss, unfortunately.
Right. 1 out of 4. Babies born to mothers consuming a high carb diet are more likely to have a neural tube defect or congenital heart disease. And also, the child is more susceptible to childhood obesity, especially. So even if you have this type of diet or insulin resistance, pre-diabetic or diabetic, before you even get pregnant, and it's best to be able to change your diet and heal from insulin resistance before you get pregnant, because by the time you actually are pregnant, the baby is already creating what's called, we talked about the epigenetics changes.
Yeah.
So that really happens in the first trimester. And so if you find out you're pregnant unexpectedly, I mean, if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably expecting to be pregnant, right?
Yeah.
But during that first trimester is really when all those epigenetic imprints are happening on the baby.
So it's kind of like programming their DNA to behave in a certain way.
Right.
And so this sets them up to, I guess, be more storage prone for fat and sugar. So it changes the way that their metabolism functions and how insulin works in their body. So, I mean, they could essentially be born insulin resistant.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, if you're insulin resistant and your insulin levels are high during pregnancy, you're exposing the baby over and over and over again to that elevated insulin. Not only is it programming their DNA, but it's also programming their tissues.
Right. Exactly. So when they are out in the world and living as a child, that they're going to be more prone to, once they do eat even just a small amount of carbs, that they're more apt to be able to store those carbs. And so they're adapting to that environment of pre-pregnancy and pregnancy that they were exposed to.
That's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
That's so impactful. I mean, that's such an impactful message.
Well, and they want, there's a lot of research going on of like why children are becoming more obese now, even though the diet is somewhat similar to like what our parents' diet was. And they are now learning that a lot of it has to do with the epigenetic changes during pregnancy.
Yeah. Wow. That's crazy. I mean, the ability to sort of like pass on poor metabolism from you to your baby. And that just, I mean, that sets it, anybody who's been through weight struggles especially for their entire lifetime understands how difficult and demoralizing that can be. And, to unintentionally set your child up just because the dietary education maybe wasn't there for what should be done before pregnancy and during pregnancy to help prevent that in children. I mean, that's why we do what we do.
Exactly. So obviously it's really important that we keep our overall carb consumption moderate and that we significantly reduce or eliminate the simple carbs and the sugar in our diet. So Kristen's going to tell us which foods that we need to avoid during preconception and pregnancy.
Yeah. So I think the big one is sugar. Everybody knows that. I mean, it's definitely not a healthy thing to be eating candy bars. I hear a lot of people say things like, oh, everything in moderation. Well, there's nothing moderate about a candy bar. Like there just isn't. Anything that includes like high fructose corn syrup, it's not food really.
Right.
I mean, this is a highly processed product. At least getting those things out of the diet is a really great first step. I mean, this includes things like soda. Even if you're drinking diet soda, we're going to talk in just a second about artificial sweeteners. But I mean, these aren't food, and they're certainly not healthy food, and they're absolutely wreaking havoc on our metabolism.
So I have a question though.
Please.
Because we're all women and we all cycle and we all have our cravings for chocolate.
For sure.
And so what would you say would be the absolute best alternative to a candy bar?
Probably a square or two of very dark chocolate that contains less sugar. I mean, there are even some varieties now that are making chocolate with, instead of cane sugar, they're making it with like coconut sugar. There's a brand that I love called Eating Evolved, and coconut sugar has more fiber in it in addition to the sugar. So that would be a great alternative. But
there was another brand, I can't remember the name of it, but they make it with stevia.
Oh yeah.
Which is a natural artificial sweetener. Well, it wouldn't be artificial.
No,
a natural sweetener that is very low calorie.
It's made from a leaf. It's actually made from a plant.
It's an herb.
And so it's not as highly refined, and it doesn't have the same impact on blood sugar. There are some studies that suggest that any sweet taste for us, in about 25% of the population, a sweet taste can actually cause like a preemptive release of insulin. So it doesn't happen in everybody, but it does happen in some people. I don't know how you would be able to know that unless you were cutting sugar and still like eating some of the more natural sweeteners or like stevia, and you were still noticing that you were having a problem controlling blood sugar. But yeah, some people do still release a bunch of insulin, even though there's no sugar to respond to, essentially.
So at the grocery store, when the chocolate bars say 72% cocoa, right? Then that's the bars that I should go after, the dark chocolate, because they have less sugar.
They do have less sugar, and you can look on the label and see like how many grams per serving and what a serving size is, because they're all a little bit different. But I would say aim above 70% or above for dark chocolate. I prefer to get chocolate that doesn't have like soy lecithin in it. I also prefer chocolate that's just chocolate. I mean, I like dark chocolate, so I don't prefer it to have milk in it, but some people may. So.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good alternative to a sweetener. But so sugar, we just talked about sugar and candy and like some of these really obvious things. But the other thing is these refined, simple carbohydrates that we talked about. So anything that's made from white flour. And that unfortunately kind of cuts out a lot of convenience foods that people are used to eating. Even sometimes when you're eating, quote, whole wheat bread, it's not actually whole wheat. I mean, these things are still ground down into flour. You're still getting much more starch than you would get if you were just like eating the grain itself. So cutting out things like bread, pasta, cereal, crackers. I mean, a lot of these
pancakes,
yeah,
bagels,
I mean,
waffles,
breakfast foods that people are used to. I think I have to say, since kind of adjusting my diet, I think breakfast was the hardest meal to get used to.
Mm-hmm.
And I've basically gotten used to eating breakfast similar to like dinner.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of the same foods. Like I eat, clean meats and lots and lots and lots of vegetables. And so I tend to keep my diet really low in carbohydrate in the morning because I'm kind of one of those extreme responders. Like I'm one of those people that has to keep the carbohydrate a little bit lower because I'll have that exaggerated insulin response. I'm very prone to hypoglycemia, so I have to be careful with that in the mornings. So,
so what if somebody is eating cereal or oatmeal right now in the morning? What are some ways that they can modify their breakfast to be able to be more balanced?
I think one of the big things is adding a quality source of protein and fat along with those carbohydrates. So maybe oatmeal is completely fine for you in the morning. Like maybe you can handle that carbohydrate load, but you just add like some coconut cream to it, or, you stir in a little bit of butter to add that healthy fat. Not only does that help you feel more satiated, but it also slows the absorption of that carbohydrate. It's going to spike your blood sugar much slower and much less than it would if you just ate those carbs by themselves.
So like oatmeal with maybe plain Greek yogurt
Yeah.
that's high in protein
Mm-hmm.
and a good source of fat as well.
Eat some eggs.
Nuts and seeds.
Yeah, nuts and seeds.
Coconut shavings,
definitely.
something like that. So don't just have the plain oatmeal with a little dash of sugar on top of it.
Stirring in maple syrup. I mean, maple syrup is certainly a much better alternative.
Or brown sugar is common, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you need that little kick of sweetness, just doing like a little bit of maple syrup or a little bit of honey if you really need it. Otherwise, just, allowing those carbohydrates like that oatmeal or like some millet or amaranth or something can be really delicious for breakfast. Adding in a good source of fat and having some protein along with it will really help to kind of curb that sugar and insulin response, especially in the morning.
Right. Yeah, I've noticed that a lot too. And anybody who's dealing with like adrenal fatigue, or, completely stressed out, which is basically equals adrenal fatigue.
Yeah, pretty much.
Having a lower carb diet in the morning is ideal. And then slowly increasing your carbs over the day is actually a way to help balance out your adrenals. And so you might notice that for me, that's definitely how I am. And I focus on having really minimum carbs in the morning as well, like Kristen. And so my breakfast usually consists of 2 over easy eggs with sauteed kale or some type of green, right?
Yeah.
And then I'll make me possibly a smoothie in the morning, but make sure it's just like dark berries. And
mostly vegetables and a few dark berries. I mean, berries are great, and we'll talk about that in a second, and the good carbohydrates that you should eat. But berries are great because they're a lower sugar, much higher fiber variety of fruit than a lot of like the really high sugar fruits. So yeah, I mean, focusing a lot on maybe having vegetables in the morning, because this is also where you're going to get a lot of nutrients.
Mm-hmm.
So grains might feel filling in the morning, and like I said, there's nothing wrong with if your blood sugar control is doing okay and you're adding in your healthy fats and proteins. There's nothing wrong with having some grains or some starch and stuff in the morning. But if you're noticing that is problematic for you, you may just want to focus on having something a little bit different.
And a sign that is problematic is really if you are just like, let's say you eat around 7-8 o'clock in the morning and then you're starving at 10 a.m.
Yeah.
Like really your morning breakfast should keep you going till like at least 11:30, 12, 1. Exactly.
And in the beginning, when you're just making that transition, you're going to notice that you might need to snack a little bit more often until your body starts to adjust. I mean, it does take time to start to get that sugar and insulin response under control. So if you're already at a point where you're insulin resistant, and you may not have been diagnosed with this because there's very specific testing that you have to undergo with the doctor to look at insulin resistance. Most doctors will just test your fasting blood sugar. But if you're working on getting that response to change, it does take some time to drive your insulin down a little bit so that you can have a more normal response. And then maybe you can start including a few more carbs when you get that under control. So some of the other things that we want to make sure that we're avoiding, as I kind of already mentioned, soda and any sweetened beverages. Fruit juices are kind of a hot topic because I think a lot of people think, oh, I'm drinking fruit juice, so then there's like all these great micronutrients. The problem with fruit juice, though, is that all you're doing is taking it's like sugar water, basically. There are some nutrients in there, but you're removing all the parts of the plant that contain fiber. And so you're drinking this fruit juice and it's basically just going like straight into your bloodstream as sugar. So people who think that like orange juice, a big glass of orange juice is a really great idea in the morning. Do you have any idea how many oranges you'd have to juice to actually make an entire glass of orange juice if you're doing it at home by yourself? That's a lot of oranges and that's a lot of sugar. So, drinking more water and, maybe some like herbal tea in the morning. If you're noticing that you have a lot of issues with blood sugar regulation, like these symptoms that we were talking about before, coffee might not be the best idea in the morning. So although coffee, it's not like coffee contains a bunch of sugar unless you're, getting mocha frappuccinos from Starbucks. Black coffee doesn't contain sugar, but it does stimulate your adrenals to release cortisol. And cortisol is a breakdown hormone. So we talked about like testosterone being a buildup hormone. Cortisol is a breakdown hormone. So what it does is that in order to give you that burst of energy that you need to deal with whatever your stressful situation is, it mobilizes proteins from your skeletal muscle and fats from your bloodstream, and it sends them to your liver. And what does your liver do? It makes sugar. So even though you're not directly consuming sugar with coffee, you are stimulating your adrenals to release cortisol, and that cortisol is causing your body to produce blood sugar. So if you are having issues with that, coffee might not be the best beverage to drink, and then certainly not energy drinks. In addition to the fact that these contain usually a ton of caffeine that's going to cause that adrenal stimulation, they're also full of a bunch of other garbage ingredients, and these things are dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
These have killed children.
Right.
So, I mean, the amount of stimulant and the amount of caffeine, most bodies are we're not designed to deal with that kind of influx. So another thing I want to mention is artificial sugars and sweeteners. So in this whole discussion about blood sugar, it might seem like artificial sugars are a good replacement because they don't contain calories and they don't raise your blood sugar. They're often marketed to people on low calorie diets, and they're often marketed to people who are diabetic because they don't have that immediate like glucose response. They don't break down into glucose. But artificial sweeteners are actually pretty problematic. There's quite a bit of research out there that suggests that they have some of the same metabolic consequences as eating straight sugar. Not only that, they almost act as like antibiotics in our gut. Like they kill off our beneficial gut bacteria, and that has an impact on our metabolism, and just can cause all kinds of problems. I'm sure in many podcast episodes we'll be talking about how important the gut is and how important the gut bacteria is to our overall health, to our metabolism, to our fertility. So these are just things that we don't want to be putting in our body. They do increase insulin resistance, even though they don't directly affect our blood sugar. And they have been shown, like pregnant women consuming a lot of artificial sweeteners, they've been shown to have children who end up obese. So very similar metabolic consequences, even though we're not consuming the sugar.
So the reason why people are going for that low calorie or Diet Coke or things like that is because we've been taught that that's going to be a way to make sure that we don't gain weight or that we might lose weight. Right. And so what are some alternatives that we can do if we just want a really sweet like drink or something to give us a little treat? What would we drink?
Well, there are a couple of options, like a little bit of fruit juice here and there. Like I mentioned, not drinking like an entire glass of orange juice. There are some drinks that are sweetened with stevia. We mentioned stevia before. I personally have a love affair with kombucha.
Yeah, I was gonna say kombucha.
It's a little different. Some people aren't used to that little bit of sour that you get. It almost has it's like a bubbly drink with just like a hint of like an apple cider vinegar or something. So fermented foods, because they're fermented, they do have that little bit of like a sour cream, think of how sour cream tastes and imagine that in like kind of like a vinegary beverage. But a lot of kombuchas have little bits of fruit juice added to them. Most of the sugar is fermented out. So you get all these beneficial probiotics and you still get like that little bit of sweet taste.
Right. I think there's another drink, Kavita. I don't know if it's available everywhere, but it's a fermented coconut water.
Yeah.
Which is also pretty low in sugar and gives you a great probiotic type of drink. So you can look up for probiotic drinks, which can be really satisfying to people and really low in sugar.
Yeah, it's like kombucha or like a coconut kefir. Like you might think of kefir as dairy, and there are dairy kefirs, but it's basically like something that's a liquid that's fermented at room temperature, and that could either be dairy, it could be coconut milk, it could be coconut water, it could just be regular water with a little bit of fruit juice added.
Right.
So there are some other options, and like kombucha and kefir, they're so easy to like make yourself at home.
Yeah, you could. Yeah, if you get ambitious and you like the do it yourself.
And you don't want to pay $4 a bottle to buy it at the grocery store. Yeah, there are definitely some good options there. One other thing that I want to mention, since we're still talking about foods to avoid, we haven't even moved on to all the good stuff yet, but I want to talk about fructose for a minute, because the argument that's made, like, for a sweetener like agave is what, like 90% fructose? I mean, it's some ridiculous amount. And the argument is that fructose isn't processed the same way as glucose is in our body. So glucose raises our blood sugar, but fructose is processed by the liver. Therefore, it doesn't immediately raise our blood sugar. Therefore, it's an acceptable alternative for people with blood sugar issues or people who are looking to avoid sugar. I'm going to bust that myth a little bit here now, because although fructose is processed directly by the liver, it's not absorbed into the bloodstream the way that glucose is. It doesn't affect our blood sugar like right in that second. It actually is still associated, just like artificial sweeteners, with all of these same metabolic consequences of excess sugar consumption. So it's processed in the liver, but what it does when it's processed in the liver is that it creates excessive triglycerides. So fats. It basically causes your liver to produce fat.
Fatty liver?
Yeah. Some people are already more prone to that. We talked in our genetics episode about choline and phosphatidylcholine and this PEMT gene, and quite a few people have SNPs in that gene. And so they're already more prone to not being able to move fats out of the liver. So you're producing a bunch of fats in the liver, then you're not able to move them out, and you end up with fatty liver. Compromising your liver function is extremely harmful to your metabolism. And also your liver does like 500 super important things in your body. So you need to make sure that you're not doing anything that's going to compromise the function of that organ.
Your liver is your master organ.
Absolutely.
I would say, besides the brain, maybe even more than the brain, the most important organ in our body.
I would say the brain, the heart, and the liver. Those are like kind of the big three that, you can't live without any of those things.
The liver often gets forgotten.
It does.
We don't talk about it much, especially because it regenerates and it's so, robust in its own way, but it can get bogged down real easy.
Well, it's a nutrient hog. All of these detoxification pathways and metabolic pathways are so nutrient intensive. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the first things to go, especially when we're eating a diet that's high in sugar and refined carbohydrates. We lose all these nutrients. We talked about that at the beginning, how when you process foods, you strip out all the nutrition, all the things that are good about them, and you're basically just eating empty carbs and calories. So your liver is going to be a little short on nutrients if you're eating a nutrient poor diet, and then it can't function the way that it's supposed to. And then you add all this sugar, all this fructose on top of that, and you're causing some pretty serious issues.
Right.
So fructose, in addition to being linked to fatty liver, is also linked to obesity and heart disease and increased insulin resistance. We already talked about, Dr. Haley gives a great overview on why insulin resistance is so harmful to fertility. So it's not a good alternative to just, I'm going to dump agave into my cereal or, my oatmeal or something instead. So fructose is not a good alternative to glucose.
A lot of people associate fructose with it being in fruit.
It is.
And so would you say that fruit is okay to eat?
Absolutely, because fruit is not just pure fructose. Most fruit also includes a little bit of glucose. So it's, not just going straight to the liver to be processed. You're still getting a little bit of that normal blood sugar response, but fruit also contains fiber when you're eating the whole fruit, as opposed to, squeezing it into a fruit juice. So fruit is a whole food. You're getting much less fructose in a whole piece of fruit than you would if you were, having a teaspoon or a tablespoon or half a cup of agave. Right. And so it's totally different. Whole food is completely different than these processed, highly refined sugars that we're talking about.
And fruit, I find once you're starting to change your diet and really get rid of the processed foods, breads, pastas, and things like that, and you start craving something sweet besides the very dark chocolate, right? You can go and eat a piece of fruit. It's so satisfying. I mean, fruit can be really that perfect sweetness that you need to just quench that satisfaction or that craving, right? So like a mandarin or a green apple or just a handful of berries.
Absolutely.
Can do the trick.
I think people don't realize how much our tastes truly change. Guys, when you start to cut out sugar, if you stick with it and you're diligent with it for like 2 to 3 weeks, you will stop craving it.
Yeah,
I
scientifically,
promise.
they have found that your taste buds change shape. And so so what happens is your taste buds will actually adapt to the amount of sugar that you're eating. It will down regulate. And then when you get rid of it, it will actually start to up regulate your taste buds again.
Right.
And so it becomes a lot more sensitive. And so what seemed okay sweet before becomes really sweet.
Yeah. Like I can taste the sweetness in raw green cabbage now. And like there are certain vegetables, like I can taste the sweetness in a sweet potato. And even in some of these green vegetables, like vegetables are still carbohydrates. They're still carbohydrates. They're great sources of carbohydrates because they're lower in sugar and they contain all this wonderful, beautiful
and they're
fiber.
low calorie too.
Yeah.
So you can really fill up on a huge salad and get maybe 300 calories. It's a great meal. And you don't feel like you totally overate or, that fatigue after your meal.
Well, so I think this is probably a good transition for us to make to the what should we eat conversation, since we've talked a whole bunch about what we shouldn't eat. So the main thing that you should be filling your plate with at every meal is non-starchy green vegetables. Dr. Haley just talked about how amazing these foods are because they're low in calories, they're low in carbohydrates, they're very high in nutrients. You can eat a ton of them, so you can fill up on vegetables, and you're in really good shape if you're primarily focusing on non-starchy green vegetables as your primary carbohydrate source. And then you can start adding in things like some starchy carbohydrates. Some like sweet potatoes are great, even white potatoes in moderation.
Squash.
Yeah, squash is fantastic. I absolutely love like butternut squash, acorn squash. I think we're kind of in the season for delicata squash, which is one of my favorites.
I've been obsessed with it lately.
I've noticed that. You always come to our meetings with delicata squash in your Tupperware, glass Tupperware, of course, not plastic. So low sugar whole fruits, like we talked about, that handful of berries. Citrus fruits are low in sugar and they give you a little bit of tang and some flavor to your food. Green apples are fabulous. Tomatoes are a fruit. Avocados are a fruit. Avocados are fabulous because of how much healthy fat they contain. So that kind of offsets
fiber.
And fiber. They're very fibrous. And then of course, your legumes and your whole grains. So legumes are going to include like chickpeas, lentils, black beans, peas, green beans. Those are great foods.
So these foods, beans, lentils, and whole grains seem to be more controversial. I'm sure there's a lot of listeners that are saying, yeah, but what was it? Grain brain. They told me not to eat any of these foods.
Yeah. So here's something I think we should transition a little bit to talking about some of the popular diet advice that's out there. I want to stress that there are a huge variety of diets in global culture that can be considered healthy. There are tons of cultures that thrive on all different types of diets. I mean, I agree that we probably were not eating grains and legumes to the extent that we currently eat them in our culture, but that doesn't mean that these foods can't be healthy for us. I think one of the big things is that if there are gut issues or any kind of digestive problem, the best way to prepare these foods to access their nutrition better is to soak them and sprout them. Many traditional cultures didn't just like eat dried beans. They soaked them, sprouted them, fermented them, and it made them easier to digest.
So what is it about soaking and sprouting that makes them more nutritious?
So there's two things. One is that it kind of pre-digests them. And it breaks down this phytic acid complex. So phytic acid binds to minerals and it kind of either passes them through the digestive tract unabsorbed, or it can actually even bind to our own minerals and kind of leach those from the body. So you start to pre-digest these digestive enzyme inhibitors, this phytic acid. So it breaks them down and it makes the nutrition that's contained within those beans or grains, which are the seeds of grass plants, more accessible to us. So it makes them easier to break down in the digestive tract, and it makes them the nutrition in them more accessible for us.
I know another piece of sprouting the grain too is that the grain is actually the seed grain is being tricked into thinking that it's going to be develop into a whole plant.
Yeah.
And so that germ is actually starting to become alive again and replicating its nutrients.
Mm-hmm.
And so the nutrients within that germ is going to quadruple or, increase exponentially. And then once it's sprouted, then that's when you actually eat it and you get that exponential.
Yeah, I think we talked last
nutrients.
time about like sprouted legumes and how they like quadruple in folate content when you sprout them. So not only does it make the nutrition in them more available, but there's actually more nutrition in sprouted grains and legumes. That's a really good point. Thank you for bringing that up.
Another trick too is a lot of people have a hard time digesting beans and lentils. And that's why a lot of people avoid these superfoods, is what I call them.
Because they cause gas.
Exactly.
For a lot of people.
Nobody wants gas. And so a trick is that you can actually cook them in a pressure cooker, or what is all the rage now is the Instapot,
yes.
which you can break down those lectins that often causes the gas within beans and lentils, and you can digest them a lot easier if you can pressure cook them.
So I would say if you have a lot of problems with those foods, you can try soaking, sprouting, and then pressure cooking them.
Yeah.
And you may actually be able to tolerate some of those. Like I can tolerate soaked, sprouted, and pressure cooked much better than I can tolerate, just regularly soaked. So right. I don't eat a lot of grains and legumes in my diet just because of my history with digestive issues, but I think they can be fabulous foods for many people. So I don't necessarily think that they need to be completely eliminated from the diet. There are certain cases where, people may have a lot of digestive dysfunction. Gluten is kind of a separate issue. That's a whole podcast episode in itself, one that we will absolutely do for you guys and kind of explain why that can be a problematic food for a lot of people. But non-gluten containing grains and legumes can be absolutely fabulous. And it just depends on the person. So they're not right for everybody, but that doesn't mean that they're not right for anybody.
Right.
So a lot of this really dogmatic nutrition advice just doesn't take that bio-individuality into account. And that's another point that, when we're sitting here talking about carbs in moderation, we're not telling you necessarily to eat a super low carb diet. We're telling you to eat whole food sources of carbohydrate. And what that means for you might look really different to one person than it does to somebody else. So the important takeaway here is to pay attention to how you feel. Take into account all these symptoms that we mentioned of poor blood sugar regulation. If you're feeling that way after eating really high carbohydrate foods, you might need to cut back. Maybe you don't need to cut back. You just need to add some more fat and protein. Fat and protein not only slows the absorption of sugar, but it also helps you feel more satiated. It curbs hunger and it tastes good.
Yeah.
The fat makes everything taste good. Rub some butter on it, make it taste better. But you need to spend some time experimenting with what works for you. Just because a keto diet might have worked for your neighbor doesn't necessarily mean that that's right for you. I mean, we need carbohydrates for proper thyroid function and to support adrenal function. And some people think, oh, well, I'm going to go keto to lose weight. And they do lose weight, but they crash their thyroid in the process, or they crash their adrenals in the process. So respecting your personal biochemistry and understanding that one person's carbohydrate intake, just because that worked for them doesn't mean that it's going to work for you. That's a really important piece to understand. I really want you guys to kind of take that away from this episode.
Right. It really is. It does mean that it takes a lot of experimenting with your own diet and trying, just start with breakfast and change up what you're doing for breakfast and see how you feel. And can you get all the way to lunch without crashing? Do you have to have that coffee? Are you falling asleep in that morning meeting? And so just take your symptoms and experiment and find out what's going to be the right amount of carbs for you.
Yeah. So, insulin does other things in the body besides just regulate our blood sugar. We just talked about, hormone balance, thyroid balance, adrenal balance. There are some other things as well that insulin is important for. So making sure that we're not driving that excessively low. We are meant to secrete some insulin. So, going keto for a lot of people is going to cause imbalances in other parts of the body. Like we talked about, a paleo diet that disallows grains and legumes might absolutely be right for you. It's the way that I personally eat. That's what feels best for my body, but it might not feel best for your body. So if you're feeling like you need more carbs, eat some more carbs. Just make sure that they're whole food carbs, that they're not any of these foods, quote, foods that we talked about in the avoid section. So as long as you're eating whole food sources of carbohydrate and you're not having these symptoms of blood sugar dysregulation, you're probably doing okay. So I would say for most people, you should be able to operate pretty well around maybe 100 to 150 carbs a day, which is about half. That is exactly,
right?
Grams of carbohydrate per day. And that's about half of what current dietary recommendations are. But that is by no means like a low carbohydrate diet. A low carbohydrate diet is going to be below 100 grams a day, and in some cases below 50 grams per day. So you don't need to go that low to be able to regulate your blood sugar for most people. Now, if you're experiencing significant insulin resistance or you have PCOS, you may need to go a little bit more low carbohydrate. But I think most people can operate really well between about 100 to 150 grams per day.
That's great.
I would consider that a moderate carbohydrate diet.
Yeah. Well, I think we've given you a ton to think about.
Yeah.
Hopefully some good takeaways that you can start experimenting with your own diet. And you can find out more information by going to our website at tinyfeet.co. That's .co. And we have some blogs on our website. We'll be posting one about the sugar podcast that we just discussed, as well as a full-on blog to detail out exactly, actually get more in depth in regards to the things that we just discussed.
Yeah, definitely.
You can also go to our website and download the free ebook called the Quick Start Fertility Guide. And that's a 28-page book that will detail out, just quick steps, 5 easy steps to get started with your diet. So it talks about these foods to avoid and which foods to add in, as well as talks about stress, lifestyle, sleep, things
toxins,
like that. Yeah.
A couple of important toxins to avoid.
The best toxins to avoid. So that's a great ebook. And then next week, we're going to have a podcast on the importance of sufficient sleep. So what is it about sleep and how is it related to poor fertility outcomes?
Absolutely. I think this is one of those really undervalued aspects of health that we just think, well, we're stressed and we're busy, so we can sacrifice sleep and it's okay. We'll sleep when we're dead, or we'll catch up on it later.
We'll sleep when we're dead. That's the common U.S. theme.
It definitely is. So this is really important, and we are excited to bring you a whole podcast episode about why sleep is so important and why you should probably be getting more of it.
Thank you, and we hope you jump onto our podcast next week.